Well, I want to thank everybody for being here today. This is the startup of the first Tuesday, this August 3rd, I'm the 4th, August 4th. Thanks, Bob. I'm usually a day behind, so it fits in. August 4th, first Tuesday. Remember, we have first Tuesday at the Metro Archives, the first Tuesday of the month, except July. And so we're starting back, and we've got a great program today. In September, we will have Pat Cummings here. He's with the Native American History Association, and he will be speaking on the 1823 suspension bridge over the Cumberland River. They did some archaeological work, and he's got some information on that. It's a really interesting project, so I will put out the word on that, so be looking for that one to come up. Today we're having a program on the Tennessee State Penitentiary. Hard time, the Tennessee State Pen from 1830 to 1992. And we have with us today Yoshie Lewis and Allison. Yoshie authored 2 previous publications from Arcadia, Then and Now, Lorton, and Images of America Muscle Shoals. She has a BA in Art History from the University of California and an MA in Film Producing and Video from American University. Allison is a Nashville born and raised and has worked in public history field for many years, most recently as a curator of Travelers Rest Plantation. He's museum design consultant, graphic artist, and writer. And they pulled together a lot of images on the state prison. So I hope you enjoy this today, and without further, I will turn it over to them. Thank you.
And I want to thank you all for coming out and seeing us today. It's nice to see a full house when you're talking about something you love. And oddly enough, this is something I love. Yoshie is actually really she was the groundswell behind this project. She's the one who came to me and said, hey, you want to write a book about the Tennessee State Penitentiary? And I'd never thought about it before, but that's one thing that really gets my attention is I like the bad side of history. There's just something cool about that hidden dark part of history. I love ghost stories. I love that kind of hidden areas of history. So I said, hey, don't know anything about it, but let's do it. And we learned a lot doing this, both about writing a book and about this gem of an odd gem, but a gem of our historical past that's still right here in our town that nobody really seems to know what to do with anymore. But we're going to kind of take a quick jaunt through about 150 years of history here. We're going to concentrate on Nashville's penitentiary, and a lot of it is going to be concentrating on this particular building. And if you've lived in Nashville or if you watched the movies in the last 20 years, you probably are pretty familiar with it. It's the one that everybody calls the castle. Yoshie, in fact, was the one who found this image, which Bob and I were talking about that earlier, because it's a very familiar image. A lot of people think they've seen this image. They haven't. This is actually, she found this, especially for the book, it was the first time it was ever published. It was the glass plate negative original that a collector in Texas actually owns, for whatever reason. So this is it, brand new in 1898. Looks very similar today. But we're actually going to go through how it came to be. We're going to concentrate mostly on the Nashville area. In the book, we touch on things like Brushy Mountain and the other correctional facilities in the state. But we're going to kind of concentrate on Nashville because I'm a native, and this was really the reason I wanted to do the book, is to learn more about this particular institution. But let's start where things always start, in the beginning, back in the old days. Now, keep in mind, it's the history of the prison in Nashville is really the history of the penal system in this country. And when Nashville was founded back in the 1780s, it was like most American institutions, most American cities at that point. There wasn't a professional police force. There was not an incarceration facility, and there wasn't a crime rate that would support either. When Nashville was founded, it was a very, very small community. Most people knew everybody else. They tended to settle matters their own way, for better or for worse. And jail in those days was not a punishment in its own right. Jail was a place you put miscreants until they came up with their punishment. Most punishment was either corporal or capital at that point in time. So basically, the jails in our town in the early days would have looked a lot like this. I will say the reason I put the Claiborne County Jail in Tazewell up there is it was built in 1819. That, from what I found out writing this book or helping write this book, that may be the oldest freestanding jail in Tennessee, which gives you a good example of the kind of lockup that these little communities had in those days. They've renovated it since that photo was taken, and they're trying to do kind of a local groundswell push to restore that building. What I can say about it, though, is that's absolute luxury compared to the Nashville jail, as it was in the early days. That one underneath there is the one, it's no longer there. The Miller County Jail in Tuscumbia, built about 1840, that's closer to what we had. It was a one-room log cabin. There were ventilation holes in the walls, and that was pretty much it. So horse thieves, squatters, anybody that broke the law in early Nashville would be put in a tiny little place like that, and then left to sweat it out until their trial came up. As I said, the punishments were pretty intense in the early days, and we touch on that a little bit in the book. That in the background is in this area right here. I don't know if I can't do that. But down here in the right-hand corner, that actually is from a plat map of Nashville in 1804. And it shows you the location of the original jail right there. The stocks were next to it, stocks and pillories. The little log jail, which was surrounded by a picket fence. And then the log courthouse as well, built in 1788. So in that little corner of Public Square, that was right off of Market Street, which is now 2nd Avenue North, and Spring Street, which is 1st Avenue. Right in that area, on the would be, I guess the western quadrant of Public Square Park today. That's where the original jail stood. And like I said, you'd put people in there until it was time to take them out to punish them, and the punishments were pretty nasty. Up at the top is the flogging with a, well, I didn't put that on there for good reason. Flogging with a black snake whip was pretty common in those days. Up at the top, though, was you got branding. That's from a rather famous incident where a man was branded S for slave stealer, and he became quite the talk of America in the 1850s. But other brands would be HT for horse thief, M for manslaughter or murder. This is the procedure, and I was really surprised to find this doing the research for the book. We're going through the old county courthouse records. Solomon White in 1789 was found guilty of manslaughter, and what I ran into was an English 18th century trial with a few tiny little twists to make it American. It was still the British court system. He was given that he was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced originally to death, but he pled benefit of clergy, which is an old English rule. If you could read or write in medieval England, you were not of the common stock, and you were usually a priest, and so you would be tried by a clergy court, a Catholic court in the early days. That little weird tangent just became legal precedent, and it went right into our country. So Solomon White pled benefit of clergy, and instead he was branded rather than being hanged. And according to his trial records, he shall be branded on the brawn of the left thumb, that's that little area right there, with the letter M, and that the iron be kept thereon until the said Solomon White express the words, God save the state, which has just replaced king. That's all it has. God save the state. One hopes that he talked fast when they did that. That actually, that and the notching of the ears was also done. You'd be put in the pillory and they'd notch your ears nearly. It's brutal, but it served a purpose in these early communities. There was no prison, and hanging might be a little too harsh for a first offender. You caught with somebody else's horse and it was a little murky about how you got the horse, they'd notch your ear or brand you. That being said, if they caught you the second time and you had already a brand or you had a notched ear, you were a repeat offender and you were hanged at that point. So it was a way of going easy on the people in a way. Before there was a prison, this is how they demonstrated mercy. At the bottom is the stocks and pillories, of course, which was just more of a, it looks kind of silly today, and it looks kind of almost trite, and kind of humiliating, but not much. That could be fatal too, because you were out there in the elements, and if you weren't in good health anyway, putting you out in the cold might kill you. That being said too, it wasn't just rocks and tomatoes they threw at these people. Sometimes, it wasn't just eggs and tomatoes they threw at them. Sometimes rocks were hurled at their head, and that could end up being fatal as well. So The punishments tended to be rather direct and rather brutal in the early days. And of course, there was the number one punishment of all, capital punishment. This is just a list of some of the folks that faced the ultimate punishment in early Nashville. These are all coming from the early newspapers of the area. And what I found interesting was there's a survey of early executions, a book that was just published about capital punishment in Tennessee. It came out in early 2000s. Many of these are not on it. I was amazed at how incomplete the early list really was. John Easton Valentine, Charles Powell, and Michael West. You talk about a real lost opportunity. I believe Powell and West actually wrote their memoirs, and it was published by the Nashville newspaper in 1802. There's not a copy of it that exists today. I'd love to get a copy and read it, but I don't think there's any out there. One of the most notorious ones, the 8 soldiers who were executed for desertion all at once by firing squad outside of Nashville in 1815. So it was a fairly common thing, but Nashville was a small town. You can see the spacing. 1801 through 1803 were pretty bad, but then you go almost 9 years before the soldiers are executed. It wasn't an everyday occurrence, and the crime rate tended to be manageable in a small town like Nashville. It wasn't really until about 1820 that Tennessee started seeing what you consider big city crime. And this was the other reason I took the job with Yoshie, is I wanted to know more about this. This is one of the big holes in the story. This is the original Tennessee State Penitentiary, which was fairly close by. If you want to know exactly where it is, I'm about to show you, because you can still go visit part of it today. But this is it as it looked just on completion, at about 1829, 1831. It was built over a course of several years. There was a lot of debate in the legislature about whether we even needed a penitentiary at that point, because penitentiaries were brand new on the scene. And there were 2 schools of thought in America. There was the Pennsylvania school, and then there was the Auburn system. Eastern State Penitentiary is still standing in Philadelphia, and you can go visit it today. It's a very, very creepy building, and it has a very, very creepy past. And I'm not talking about ghosts. You know, that's one thing. You can take the ghosts or leave them, but what went on in that institution was later viewed as cruel and unusual punishment. The Pennsylvania system was where we get the term penitentiary. The men were confined, mostly men, some women. They were confined under a skylight that never was shielded. They called it the eye of God. And so that God was always looking down upon you. You didn't speak at all. It was not allowed. You would be punished, corporal punishment, if you spoke out of turn. You labored in silence, you did your time in silence, and you sat in your cell in silence, and you reflected on what you had done to offend humanity. And then when you were released, the theory was when you were released, you were fully penitent and you went back into society. In reality, many of them were mentally ill. They had broken down under the strain of that. But that was the humane system. The Auburn system was hard labor, and that's where we get things like that. Yes, many of our more familiar 19th century institutions were born in the Auburn State Prison in New York. You have the skunk suit, as it's sometimes lovingly called, the striped suit that the convicts were put in to identify them as offenders. The lockstep, and that's a wonderful demonstration. This was later, this was used in Tennessee in the early days, and it was phased out as cruel and unusual. Basically, those men were inches from each other, and one holding onto the other, and when they moved, it was chained and in lockstep cadence. That's where we get the term lockstep. And there was no room to turn around. It was for the guard's safety, but it quickly became something that was abused and used for punishment. But the whole idea here was not as rigid as the Pennsylvania system, but I think the selling point for Tennessee was you could make some money off of this. And this was going to be a system that was fraught with corruption throughout the 19th century. They were put to work to pay off their debt to society and give them something to do. Idle hands, you know, the devil's playground. But it also became a big moneymaker for states like Tennessee. So this is the one we chose, the Auburn system. And this is the building that was used originally to house these folks. Now, a wonderful photograph right there. I can't say that I have access to it. I'm using this kind of illegally right here. But Jim's a good guy. He lets me get away with that sometimes. We didn't use this in the book because we don't have the rights to it, but he used it in Cities Under the Gun, his wonderful collection of photographs of Tennessee during the Civil War. That's it during the war, and the stockade out front was built to house military prisoners, Confederates and political prisoners. But you can see the original cell block with the two wings that were built a little bit later on either side. It was perpetually overcrowded and dirty. According to the 1855 business directory, it was in a flourishing condition, 3 acres enclosed by a substantial stone wall, 27 feet high from 4 to 5 feet thick. There are now confined to the penitentiary 250 convicts, 248 males and 2 females. However, it also noted there were only 232 cells in the building. So much for the original idea of putting them in solitary confinement. They had to share them. There was also no breaking down of these folks by age, by class of criminal or anything like that. So you would have, in one case, there was 2 young boys that were doing hard time right alongside murderers and all sorts of sickos that were locked up in here. And there was a lot of things like that that kind of gave this place a very unsavory reputation. Ironically, Governor Andrew Johnson was dead set against it, considering the use he was going to put it to during the Civil War. In his view, and it's surprisingly progressive, in the 1850s, he said that in his view, prison did nothing to reform the prisoners or deter crime. Well, he's probably right on that. Long-term studies have proven it really doesn't do much, but interesting response he had for it. He said he wanted to privatize the contracts, just get rid of the prison and just use them for labor to support the state. And we were going to come very dangerously close to that view after the Civil War. Now, that's where it stood, the old one. And if you, like I said, if you want to know what it was like or where it was, you can't get better than that. One of the things that the Tennessee State Library and Archives found in their collection was the plat map that was done in 1893, just as they were about to start thinking about tearing this place down. So we have a scale, drawing plat of the old buildings as they were still standing, and using the modern magic of Google Earth, I was able to put it over at scale over the modern landscape. And it's amazing how you can still, even to this day, those diagonal streets that run right through that block there, right near the hospital. That is, this is on Church Street, by the way, just past 65, going up there between Charlotte and Church. 15th, McMillan, those, you can see the way it's cocked that way. That's the old outline of the prison there. In fact, 15th Avenue North for many, many years was known as Stonewall Avenue because it ran right along the stone wall that surrounded the outside of the prison. The main entrance, the one in the photo of down here in the front, the right and left wing, dining hall, you can see all this stuff that was still standing there at the time in 1893. At that point, the place was doomed. It was on its way out because it had outlived its purpose. It had seen service for 60 years at that point. Starting with the old days, and probably one of the most famous guys that was ever in there, John Andrews Merle, the great Western land pirate, as he was known. One of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain when he was describing the James Boys of Missouri. And he said that, looking back to the legends of John Merle in the wilds of Tennessee and Mississippi, he said, the James Boys were retail rascals, Merle wholesale. That's how he put it. Most of what you hear about this guy is nonsense, that he killed 600 people, that he was planning a slave insurrection that was going to wreck the South and then pick through the ruins of Vicksburg and New Orleans in the aftermath. What basically happened was this guy was an inept slave stealer and counterfeiter who was turned on by one of his gang members who tried to get him hanged and tried to paint him as the worst demon on the planet. It didn't work, really. This arch criminal who didn't have 2 cents to rub together when he was sentenced to 10 years in the state penitentiary. That's all he got. So evidently the jury wasn't swayed about this legend of this arch criminal murderer. What I love about that is, as it says at the bottom there, taken in the Tennessee State Prison at Nashville. You're looking at one of the few images we have of one of the early prisoners with his shaved head for the lice and that big loose shirt. That's probably his uniform that he's on. He got the benefits of the Auburn system while he was inside. He learned the blacksmithing trade. He also wrecked his health. He got the results of the Auburn system as well. He caught tuberculosis while he was inside, and they cut his prison sentence short because of that. And he was not a very well man when they released him. He ended up with a rather sad story, by the way. If you go to Pikeville, Tennessee, you really have to know somebody who can point out Merle. They're still very cagey about telling you where he is. I've been there, but there was a big guard dog. I didn't get out to actually see the grave, but he's up on a hill near Pikeville. He settled there after they let him out of prison, and he died of tuberculosis within a couple of years. And interestingly enough, on his deathbed, he supposedly said that he was guilty of everything he'd ever been accused of, except murder, of which I'm entirely blameless. So poor John Merle was a victim of his own legend, but he ended up kind of in a quiet corner of Tennessee, and he's still there today. This fellow was anything but quiet. He's another one of our more famous prisoners, Edward Zane Carroll Judson. You probably never heard of him, but you may have heard of his alias. Next to him is his victim, Robert B. Porterfield. Apparently Mrs. Porterfield and Mr. Judson were very, very close and would meet, ironically, in that very self-same city cemetery where Mr. Porterfield now lies today, because at one point Robert Porterfield found out about it and with a few cronies went hunting for Judson and took a shot at him, and Judson returned fire and killed him. He was immediately hanged by a mob, and the rope broke, or rather the sign holding the rope broke, and he fell. This was on Public Square in Nashville in the 1840s, 1846. He was held in the state prison till his trial. He was acquitted, and he quickly blew town and got out. The reason I bring him up and why you may have heard of him later is he later wrote for dime novels under the alias Ned Buntline. And if you know anything about the Old West, and Wyatt Earp in particular, that apparently he decided his heroes needed a bigger weapon than the average guy, so he supposedly bought these extra long revolvers and gave them out to Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. He became one of the guys that made Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp famous around the country. And the funny thing about it was he knew what he was talking of. He himself had a shootout here in Nashville, Tennessee. He had done time for it. So another odd connection with a rather notorious character here. And that's probably the most notorious guy in the whole history of that early prisons, Champ Ferguson, Samuel Champion Ferguson, either the devil incarnate or an misunderstood hero, depending on who you talk about. One of the most notorious guerrillas during the Civil War. They said he was accused of 51 murders at the end of the war when they put him on trial in Nashville. He said he wasn't guilty of more than, I think, 20 or 30 himself, so he took some exception at that. But he was found guilty October of 1865, and this is him in the backyard of the Tennessee State Prison as he was standing up there hearing the death warrant read. He supposedly told them that he wanted to be taken home and buried in good rebel soil in White County, and eventually that was granted to him. So the gallows stood about where McMillan and Hines Streets are standing today. So that's about where the scene is today. But that's the problem is this place was so nasty by the 1890s that Tennessee was done with it. And they needed a new facility, and so the new one was built that we're going to be talking about. The old prison went the way of the dodo and was quietly demolished over the next few years. By the 1960s, I mean, it was, that's a wonderful, Jim Wright, who used to work for the Nashville Banner, did a series on the prison in the Tennessean, actually the Tennessean, and did a wonderful series of these illustrations. But that's part of the problem. That's not an unusual scene in those days. They would have kids as young as 10 or 12 in there along these hardened cons. They were using the strap and the lash all the time. People went insane in those conditions. And escapes were rife at that point. The tunneling out became an art form in the 1890s. And even to this day, talking to people in the neighborhood, they'll still tell you there's a legend about a tunnel running under one of the streets. I think it's 15th Avenue. And they said it was, well, the warden got out in case there was trouble, he'd get his family out. But I thought to myself, well, it may be, or it could be somebody who got out, you know, illegally. But if whatever case, the place is still probably riddled with tunnels because of so many escape attempts. But by 1998, they moved the last of the prisoners out. And what was left of it was basically just sold for scrap. Oddly enough, in 1966, the old wagon shop is still standing over there on near Prison Alley, they still called it. It's still on Google Maps, by the way, but there's nothing there today. There's no street, but Prison Alley is still listed there. And that's where that old wagon shop stood. That was demolished in 1966. The warden's former residence was a tire store when that was photographed in '66. But you talk to anybody in Nashville and they'll tell you today there's nothing left of the old prison. Or is there? Talk about one of the big surprises doing this kind of thing. I know a lot about the Civil War. I know a lot about the prison, the old thing. I grew up in this town. And everybody I talked to, well, the old prison, that's gone. It used to be over there on Church Street. And then doing the research for the book, lo and behold, it's a pretty open secret in the neighborhood. The old warden's house is still standing. It's still there today. built around 1840. Today it's ESS Incorporated. They do the little plug for ESS because they were so nice to let us in. They do the speakers for drive-through restaurants and things like that. That's their business. And it looks like nothing from the outside. You knock on the door, and they're very nice. They loved us because we were finding stuff, and they were saying, "Really?" And we were learning from them. They were learning from us. They let us walk through and see some of the stuff that's inside. There was a stone quarry nearby, and you can see the prisoners were pretty good masons because this is some of the structural work in the basement here. I especially love that on the left there, because look carefully, those dots up there in the corner of it, it's an old windowsill, and you can still see where the iron bars were cut out at one point, which kind of reminds of what it was originally used. These are probably cut in the 19th century by convict stonemasons, and they're just kind of piled up in the basement where they're doing work. Brick walls on the inside, nice Victorian parlors and everything. Modern building, but it's still, you can still tell the moment you walk inside, this is an 1840s residence, and it's the last remaining bit of the old Church Street prison. It's still standing today. So that's one of those big jaw-dropping moments I had, at least writing this book, was I was like, I'd heard about Champ Ferguson all my life. I didn't realize the fellow who hanged him his house was still standing right over here. But time was moving on. By the 1890s, Tennessee was looking to the future, and they got a brand new state-of-the-art prison right there. And this is it from about 1902, that photograph. This is published in a prison report. That's the administration building. And as you'll see as we go through this, it doesn't look very different today. The biggest difference, I think, is at one point the tower was shortened and they filled in most of the windows as a security risk up there. But other than that, you know that familiar facade. You've seen it if you've ever seen the old prison. That's where the term the castle comes from, and that's what a lot of people remember it as. Prisoners called it something else, found out during this. One 1920s account refers to it as Old Red Top, because of the red tile roof. And then I found out that going through an 1860s newspaper, they talk about a prisoner who had just been sentenced to be confined at Red Top. So apparently both prisons had a red tile roof, and the name Old Red Top seems to have followed it through much of its career. But whether you call it the Castle or Old Red Top, that's the prison that most people are familiar with in Nashville today. Once again, Google Earth is wonderful for letting us tour what we cannot tour in person. There's the administration building, looking a little shorter, a little less spry than it once did. There's the cell blocks. West Cell Block, Block D, was originally for, quote, colored prisoners. Again, this is an 1890s facility. East Cell Block for the white prisoners was Block C over here. A lot of what you see in the back, though, is the modern. You can see the development of the prison through the 20th century. The Central Stores building and the manufacturing shops, those weren't there originally. The chapel is a later addition. Death Row, which was added, I believe, originally it was a small brick death house that was there in the 1920s. That was later, I think, in the 1940s, replaced by Death Row where it is today. That's where the notorious electric chair, Old Sparky, was at one point. And that's one thing that this facility became notorious for. Before it was built in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, executions were hangings and what have you, and they took place in the county where the offense was committed. So basically the public square, the hanging day, like in the old westerns where everybody comes out in a picnic, that was not an uncommon sight in Tennessee. After 1909, they moved to the electric chair, and the law changed to where executions could only be carried out on state prison property. And so most of them were carried out either here or at Brushy Mountain. This one became notorious, though, because of the electric chair, which was known with typical black humor as Old Sparky by the prisoners, which is people, kind of are shocked by that, but that's actually not an unusual nickname. A lot of them are known as that. The one that really got me was I didn't realize a lot of them called it Old Smoky as well. You talk about real black humor on that. It is it in the Smithsonian today? It ended up in a national museum, and our electric chair is still there. So there's some grim reminders of this building across the country. Now, one of the frustrating things about working on this project was we found these photos that just were not high quality enough to make the cut. And that was one of the more heartbreaking ones. That's it in, I believe, let's see, that was 1905 newspaper photo. It was either the American or the Banner went down there and published a thing called A Day at the Prison. So you're looking at, that actually, I believe, is the color block right there, as they called it in those days. Had 4 tiers. Each tier was known as a range at that point. And let's see, the ranges had, let's see, don't have my numbers on that right there, but they were initially supposed to be one prisoner per cell. That was the intention. However, this is also typical. It was designed for 800 inmates. 1,400 entered on the first day it was in operation. It was overcrowded from the beginning. So sadly, this is it on its best behavior. The only thing that really changed about this view was the filth as the years went on. 100 years later, you still would have recognized this thing, except the nice Victorian signs marking the ranges were gone, and it was crumbling and nasty and still in use all those years later. This one was probably the most spectacular shot that didn't make the cut right there. As I said, right there is where the death house is now, and you can see it's wide open in those days. There's the chow line, and this seemed to have been a photographer's feast. Whenever the prisoners lined up for chow, you see the reporter is talking about that too. It was a stunning sight. You had the African American prisoners lined up on one side of the yard, the white prisoners on the other side of the yard, over 1,000 human beings all at once when the whistle blew, and the guards with their guns and everything, and they just filed neatly into this building. So that's the dining hall they're lining into, and as you can see, the two segregated doors either side of it there. This is a very rare view of the back of the administration building, so you can actually see inside the yard of the castle today, which is a very hard thing to get to today. Oh, by the way, in the middle too, originally had the railroad contracts working with convict labor, and they had tracks that ran right through the yard. That's what you're looking at. Those are railroad tracks, and trains would line up and actually unload supplies within the yard. What's that?
The ancient St. Hell had a spur in.
Yep, there we go. And that ended, I think it was around 1912 when some enterprising convicts got a hold of a switch engine that somebody had, I guess in modern parlance, left the keys in and tried to drive it right through the wall. So after that, they kind of, basically, they cut the tracks off, and that was the end of that. But in the early days, you actually see sometimes boxcars lined up inside the yard and them unloading supplies for the workshops in here. Because convict labor was a big thing. They had workshops on the inside making wagons, and yes, license plates were stamped there, as the old cliche goes. But the big labor on this one is, if it was breaking rocks at the old prison, it was the farm, the prison farm was the new prison. The Nat Baxter Prison Farm, which was right next door, and this is an amazing shot of the convicts lining up, work detail ready to go out there. You can see the gray and black striped suits. What was amazing was to see the guards are not in uniform. They wouldn't be in uniform till the 1940s out there. You can see them carrying the Winchesters and shotguns mounted on mules. You've got trustees mounted on mules over here as work overseers. But this is one of those details about to head out in the field. They could actually produce enough not only to supply the prison for the year, but they also had a surplus that was sold on the markets in Nashville as well. So it was actually a booming operation they had there. And as I said, it was quite a sight when the convicts lined up for chow. This is it again, 1902, and a better view. And there's the boxcar, like I said, lined up there in the yard, ready to be offloaded. Well, life inside. Some more interesting stories that came out of it. If you really want to get a feel, at least from a one-sided feel, but a good feel for what life was like inside this institution, oddly enough, we're indebted to that man on the left there, Horace Woodruff. And that's probably about the only admirable thing I can say about Horace Woodruff. I apologize if there are any relatives of him, because the man did reform, and he became a very accomplished citizen in his later days. But his young days, he was bad news, and you can see across from him the result of that. And that's him and his buddies in the bottom there in 1931. He was involved in a shootout after trying to rob a grocery store in 1931, and he killed Patrolman Mike Mulvihill as he showed up to respond to the thing. There was a gunfight. One of Woodruff's companions was shot and killed, and he fired back and killed Mulvihill. He escaped death row twice. I had him ready to, in fact, within hours, because of one escape attempt, he was nearly walked his way into the death chamber when word came down on high to give him a pass, and he was put into life in prison instead of death. But he was put in there in 1923, got out on parole, came right back in 1931 for the murder of Mulvihill, and then spent the next decade basically trying to break out of prison. And he was involved in some of the bloodiest escapades this place ever saw. But like I said, prison changed him, and he was lucky in a great deal for one connection that came earlier. He didn't even know about the connection, I don't think. He had an older brother who worked for a family in Nashville as a painter, handyman, that sort of thing. And that family took a shine to him. It was the Siegenthaler family. And of all things, it was actually the elder Siegenthaler who knew him. And in fact, one of them later said that John Siegenthaler, I believe in an interview, heard about Horace Woodruff in prison and about how he was brother of this handyman, and said that he heard him described as an animal when they'd talk about him. Well, as years went on, of course, John Siegenthaler, we all know who and what he became, he worked hard to get the man paroled. He was, by that point, he'd mellowed. He was no longer an escape risk. He was no longer a security risk. And he was working as the head of the radio department. And in fact, he actually got the odd experience one day when Siegenthaler was touring to come out and shake his hand and thank him for all the efforts he'd done on his part. And they paid off. In 1962, 2 days after Christmas, Buford Ellington signed the parole, and he was let out after all those years inside. He went on to write that book, Stonewall College. Like I said, it's one-sided. And if you're in that, I can't really blame Woodruff. He was sinned against as much as he sinned. He describes how brutal the conditions really were in that place during his stint. But if you really want an eye-opening view as to that world, it's a remarkably eloquent memoir from a man who went through some nasty years inside that place. He later moved to work for an automotive company, I believe, in Nashville, and retired in the 1970s. And this is how most of us remember it, if we remember it at all. That kind of scary place over there, surrounded by lights and cars and working late into the night there. That's it in 1971. The bottom was just about to drop out of the old prison at that point. It had been standing for 80 years, and it was starting to show the cracks at that point in time. And sign of the times, I mean, you really, some of the later, this was something the Banner archives were intrinsic to, was when we got to go into the Nashville Banner archives and see the photos here in this library. Some of them are reminders that are best left unsaid. This is a pretty typical, and this one actually, I believe, is from one of the hostage crises. There were several that same year, 1975. This was one of the lesser ones. They took some hostages, they made some demands, and honestly, when you read the news accounts, the demands are things like toilet paper, more than one phone call a day, the hot showers, things like that. There were some inhumane conditions in there, and so there was these odd situations where you had formal boards of convicts sitting down with formal boards of prison commissioners and hammering out agreements, and if you let them go, well, and that could only go one direction, and that was in 1975. It all came to a head in one of the most shocking incidents that ever took place in there. I was kind of amused by how the corrections officers refer to this today. We do talk to some of them about it. They remember it as the Bologna Battle, or they call it the Pork Chop War sometimes. It all started over a really stupid thing, as such things happened. It was overcrowded, there was racial tension, it was atmosphere you could cut with a knife, and then one night they ran out of pork chops on the chow line, and they substituted bologna instead, and everybody hit the ceiling. They took over the mess hall, they took over prison blocks. It was a full-scale riot for several days. I don't know if I actually got the picture in there, I don't, of the National Guardsmen surrounding the place. You talk about shades of Attica. It's chilling when you see those guardsmen camped around the place, M16s out and everything, riot police, state troopers. It was national news, and it was terrifying. And I'm amazed to say that I don't think anybody died during that one. I want to say there. Actually, one prisoner was murdered on the inside by the fellow prisoners, but remarkably bloodless when you consider what actually happened, and remarkable that nobody opened fire. It was a near-run thing. There were several incidents where it could have turned into a full-scale bloodbath, and it didn't. Luckily, they were able to take control of the prison, get everybody back in their cells with only one death. So it ended a lot easier than it should have, probably. But it was the first thing that really shone the spotlight on how overcrowded and what the conditions were and how nasty things were turning inside what they call Ten Pen at that point. And unfortunately, 1977 was the first year the prison actually made it into the movies. So if you didn't see Marie, you're like most of Nashville in 1985. That was one of Fred Thompson's first debuts. He played the character of Fred Thompson. Yes, Marie is the story of Marie, and I believe it's Ragianti. I'm not sure, I've not met her, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name, but she was on the parole board, and she was the one that broke the Ray Blanton scandal with the paroles and what have you and everything. She sued, and eventually she's kind of sparked the whole investigation. They got Blanton out of office and everything. They made a movie about it in 1985. From what I was told, feelings were still quite raw in 1985. It spent 2 weeks in Nashville theaters and then closed almost immediately. So if you haven't seen Marie, that's probably why. It was still kind of a raw subject at that point in time. But I have to say, didn't they get a great guy to play Fred Thompson? That is just, you can't get better than that right there. By the way, Fred was playing Fred because he represented Marie Ragianti during the case. So he got to play something that he understood very, very well in this particular role. And then in 1985, the next big riot happened. Now this one was statewide. Brushy Mountain went up, a whole bunch of prisons were taken over this one. Some of us still remember this. And that's one of the scarier shots. So we did put this one in the book, because remember Attica, I mean, it said it all. The prisoners were, again, surrounded. The whole thing was, it was just a nasty situation. I'm happy to say no one was killed at the Tennessee State Prison in Nashville, but other prisoners were murdered or killed in other incidents across the state. This was a statewide uprising. And this was really the final nail in the coffin for the Tennessee State Penitentiary. Over the next few years, 1985 through 1992, they were slowly going to start to break up the large prisons and move them to different places. So now even Brushy Mountain is closed, the Tennessee State Prison is closed. 1992 was the last year it was in operation. And during that time, it saw its share of drama. And this was the chapter I was given, and for good reason, because this, like I said, I love bad boys. I love, I love a good adventure story. And I have to say, some of these I could not believe. If Hollywood came calling, I don't know why they're remaking movies. Some of these are so awesome and they haven't been retold yet. And some of them have real life parallels. This one I'm working on. So if you're thinking of writing a book, don't write this one. I'm writing this one. Yeah, as long as I can get, as soon as I can get information on this, I'm going going forward with this. This one was one of the things that sold this project on me. She said to me, Yoshie said, why don't you just go look up a few stories? I was like, yeah, let's start with that and everything. So I look up a Wikipedia article, always a great place to start on any in-depth research project, and it says, that 17 prisoners dynamited their way out of prison in 1902 and killed one of the inmates. And I said, that didn't happen. It's Wikipedia. They got that wrong. Wrong. It did happen, and there's the ringleaders. I was able to actually find a newspaper photograph of the mysterious Gus Hyatt, who was in prison for train robbery in 1902. Okay, this is Tennessee, this is not Montana, and we had train robbers in this state. I never heard this growing up. In fact, I went to school at Austin Peay, in Clarksville. About 4 miles down the road is the site of the holdup at St. Bethlehem. I was like, you're kidding! I actually got to drive out there the other day and see where Gus Hyatt single-handedly held up an L&N train out there. He was captured, sent to prison, and there, Ed Carney, also known as Hutch there at the bottom, who was every bit as pleasant as he looks in his mugshot. Just a strong-arm man. He was a stick-up artist, kind of a thug, really. And then the mysterious Buck Ballard, the other of this trio. These are the ringleaders of this thing. Buck Ballard was a nationally known bank robber. William Pinkerton called him the most dangerous man in America at one point, and yet he seems to have appeared and disappeared out of thin air. He's my holdup writing this book. What happened to him? He robbed a bank in Manchester in 1900. He was put into prison here. He blew his way out of prison with dynamite and then disappeared off the face of the earth. I can't find a trace of him after that. It's a real mystery on that. And of all of them, he's the most pleasant looking one. But right next to you could see the fruits of their labors. That ran in the banner the next day right there, the photograph there showing a convict on the platform repairing the wall with the big 8-foot hole that they'd blown in. Somehow, in those days, things were a little more lax. Hyatt and Ballard were able to get about 30 sticks of dynamite and 3 revolvers smuggled into them, and one night, right before bedtime, they busted out their hardware, opened fire on the guards, everybody. Some of the other guards, Hyatt nearly killed one of the guards he hated, and 2 other convicts actually saved the man's life and grabbed him and threw him into a cell and got him out of the line of fire. Meanwhile, Ballard and his playmates went down to the end of the block and stacked dynamite up there, lit the fuse, blew it up, didn't do enough damage, had to come back and light a second charge, and this time they knocked that little hole through, and 17 little convicts like rabbits came jumping out of that hole there and got away. One of them was shot dead. Ed Carney didn't make it. The guards reacted just in time to put a bullet into Ed Carney and killed him. As far as I know, he's still buried out there in what they call Boot Hill in that abandoned cemetery next to the wall. Gus Hyatt reappeared 12 years later, working under an assumed name in Oklahoma. He was shot dead by a cop during a routine search and seizure. He pulled a gun, and that was it. In 1914, he was finally found and killed. And like I said, Buck Ballard just disappeared. So it's kind of got some holes in it, this thing, but it's one of the most remarkable stories, one of the most dramatic stories I have ever heard from Nashville, and hardly anything known about it to this day. Wasn't the most dramatic, though. 1926 was a real bad year. That was the year that all of these guys made it out. In fact, that's not all of them. I believe the 1926 escape, that was the biggest one we ever saw out there. Let's see. It was 16 in 1902. It was 17 in 1926. They actually got one more guy out, including that fellow in the upper left corner, Don White, who was a very, very scary man, a bank robber, was later shot dead by the FBI, I think, after killing a woman and two men in Louisiana. On this occasion, though, they managed to get out, and then they were run to earth. One of them was arrested in Shelby Park after a shootout a couple of days later. Don White and his buddies got drunk, grabbed a streetcar. The old interurban terminal was right next to the prison wall, so they grabbed a streetcar and ran it off the rails, and when the cops showed up, they were still sitting there drunk and laughing and enjoying themselves when the cops surrounded them with guns. So they managed to saw their way out of jail, and that's the photo showing the... don't you love those old news photos with the arrow showing prisoners' escape route? You know, but that's the jail cell, the window they managed to saw out. So if there was a security flaw, these guys found it, but nobody found the chinks like this fella. You talk about one that would really make a great movie, John Ravinsky, and this was one of those first moments where I went, "Oh, this is creepy," because part of the Green Mile was filmed here. And this story is so akin to an earlier Stephen King story and movie. John Ravinsky was a jewel thief from Memphis, Russian-born. He had killed a woman that was known as, I believe they called her the queen of the Memphis underworld, Mae Goodwin, after strangling her over some stolen diamonds. He was arrested, put in prison here. Very hard man to hold. He had broken out of prisons all across the country and in Canada. But in 1926, he took up painting in his cell and been quietly painting his little scenes and everything until one morning that he was missing at roll call along with 12 other guys, and in searching the cell, sure enough, just like in the movie, they took the painting down from the back of the cell, and that was what was behind it, that big hole there. This one actually did make it. It was such a lousy photograph, but you can't beat that. I mean, the caption actually says it's a noted bank robber within the institution who obligingly posed for the banner cameraman. I believe that might be Don White peeking out as the guy who was later shot dead by the FBI, but still, this is one of the more epic escapes it saw. He was picked up by His Majesty's officers in Canada in 1928, put into the prison in Toronto, broke out of there, and then once again, boop, gone like a ghost. So that was the last anybody saw of John Ravinsky, who's known by a dozen different aliases. So yeah, we actually had a noted jewel thief who broke out in spectacular fashion in there. The first of our Stephen King connections here. And this is one of the more gruesome stories in the thing, and one of the things that I think Yoshie and I both went, oh my gosh, you know, when we saw the photographs, that's actually a photo of the discovery, and that photo next to it, the mugshot, or the booking photo, actually shows what he looked like in life. But there's Paul Joe Payne, the mystery man at the prison. This is an almost unbelievable story. In 1959, convict tipsters basically told the warden, if you dig in the metal shop floor, you're going to find something. And they did. They found Paul Joe Payne, who had been missing from the prison since 1939. He was officially listed as an escapee. He just slipped out. They thought there was a press tour that day, and they thought baby-faced. He was part of what they called the Baby Bandits in Chattanooga. You can see he was a young kid that he'd slipped in with the press and just kind of quietly walked out in a suit of clothes and nobody'd seen him. So he was officially an escapee at that point in time, until he surfaced all those years later under the metal shop floor. It seems nobody really can agree on what happened. In fact, Horace Woodruff talks about them digging up, oh, hi, how you doing? I know about that. He talks about them searching in the water tanks and searching all over the prison for him on different tips. But everybody knew he'd been killed. The convicts knew it, the warden didn't. And they were always wondering what had really happened to him. He said that he had been killed over $400 in craps winnings that he'd had in his pocket. Another rumor in 1959 had it that he was snitching on a, quote, dope racket that was being run inside the prison. Who knows what the real reason was, but the autopsy said he'd been hit in the head with a blunt force trauma, you know, basically, he cracked his skull, and then the metal shop floor was being poured at that point in time, so they quietly rolled him into the dirt, put the metal shop floor and several tons of concrete, kept him secure in there for all that time. When they were investigating it in 1959, we really didn't find all of the ins and outs, but two of the killers were still in prison and given additional sentences. Another had already been paroled, and I think they were looking for him. I don't know if they actually ever found him. The fourth one was actually stabbed to death in a fight in 1951 in another prison. So some really hairy stories. This is one of the more hairy ones if I can get it to work. Hi, why don't we do this? You're not going to work, are you? Oh, there you go. And if you go way back in time, we were one of the first cities to have 24-hour news coverage of a news story. This was the big media first, the hostage crisis of 1960. That's Robert Rivera down there with Big Greg O'Rear, who, if you ever met him, I wish I could have met him because he really was that big. He was one of Nashville's first motorcycle cops, by the way. And if you see the photograph of him, he's like he's nearly 8 feet tall, and he's standing next to this, looks like a toy next to him. He supposedly told the chief, they said, can you ride that thing? And he said, if not, I'll just carry it. You know, basically, he was a big guy. He was the safety commissioner at the time. Robert Rivera was from Texas. They'd been sent up here on for some offense. I don't know exactly how he got here, but everybody said Rivera was a little bit off, and one day he pulled a gun and took a bunch of hostages inside one of the administration buildings. And for the next, I think it was 72 hours, this was basically gripping the whole, there were updates, they were negotiating, they were trying to get the rear came in, and the state police had surrounded the place. They were all in one building, so basically it was a very contained thing. The other photo actually shows one of the prisoners that was being used as a mediator, and he would come out every once in a while and give demands, and they'd negotiate back and forth. The whole thing was resolved with no bloodshed, and Rivera was finally, gave up his prisoners, and I think they gave him a little tacked-on sentence, but nothing major. I think they finally transferred him out of the Tennessee prison system. But it was one of the first times we had, WSM was on the air almost 24 hours a day. We're breaking it at 2 in the morning with a new update on this. And they later published a book, and the library has a copy of it, which had some of these wonderful photographs that illustrated the drama of that time.
That's Jude Collins from Channel 4.
Oh, was it? Yep, there we go.
Oh my goodness.
So that's it. And Channel 4 they were the ones on the scene. So it's actually downstairs in the Nashville room, I believe, in the special collections of this thing. And it's, I forget what the book is called. It's something like 48 Hours or something like that in Nashville or something like that, but it's very dramatic, but it's full of these little snippets showing and it shows the whole news crew waiting for the next detail and sitting there reporting on the next development and everything. It's fascinating. Now in the day of CNN, it's amazing to look back and see the humble origins and that Nashville played a role in all that. And then this is how it came to kind of national prominence. An unlikely celebrity. Tenpen is a strange place because just in musical and entertainment terms, there have been probably more celebrity star power in this thing over the years than almost any other prison. Forget Folsom. Johnny played Tennessee State Prison too. It was basically, they had first-class entertainment, and that's one thing that really struck me was when they had, there's copies downstairs of the, what is it called? The Inside Story? Was that? The Inside Story was the prison magazine in the late 50s. And when you see the acts that were playing that stage, Johnny's on there, Eddie Arnold. In fact, there's 3 of them. You have Johnny Cash and Eddie Arnold and Minnie Pearl and all these people playing this stage on every weekend. They'd have another prison. All these opera stars going out there along with the local prison talent bands and playing right alongside them and everything. So it's such a strange thing to see these things. One of the greatest photos in that thing, it shows this fella, it was in 1955, I think it was 1955 edition, and it shows this fella standing out in the crowd right there, and he's identified as Colonel Thomas Parker, who is bidding on some prison artwork that one of the artists wants to buy one of the paintings. Yes, that's the same Colonel Tom Parker that a year later would discover Elvis Presley. So it was so strange to see these familiar faces and realize the caliber of entertainment that the prisoners had while they were inside here. And it was an odd time, the 50s in this area. There was an era of kind of reform and trying to rehabilitate prisoners and trying to give them a little more freedom in that point. And this is one of the more remarkable stories of it, also one of the more controversial ones, and there's a great documentary that was done on these folks if you want to read a little bit more about it. But The Prisonaires was a prison R&B group that formed inside the thing. These guys, in fact, I believe one of their big hit, it was cut in 1953. It was on the Sun label. It was Just Walking in the Rain, and it was the first Billboard R&B hit for Sun Records, 1953. It was later cut by other artists. Jim Reeves cut it. Johnny Cry Ray cut it. In fact, Mom remembers that. She was in England at the time, and Ray's version went to #2 in the UK charts, Just Walking in the Rain. The fellas are Johnny Bragg, Ed Thurman, William Stewart, John Drew Jr., and Marcel Sanders. All of them were longtime cons. I mean, they were hardened prisoners, but they were let out to do concerts. They went to the studios and worked toward at least getting some freedom and some rehabilitation through this. In fact, I believe, if I'm remembering this right, Johnny Bragg gave a writer's credit to one of the others. I don't know who the other one was. He was listed as a co-writer because Bragg wrote Just Walking in the Rain, but he couldn't read or write. So the other guy had to write it down for him, so he gave him a co-writing credit on the song. So one of the more remarkable things, and again, it was one of these things where also there was some controversy that why were these guys made a special case, whereas the other prisoners didn't get the same chance. So the whole thing kind of quietly dissipated as wardens changed in the late 50s. But they actually made Life magazine. This is them in 1953, practicing, well, probably posed, but practicing in the yard. And then after 1992, when it finally went apart, we had this wonderfully Victorian building, and I will say, it is a remarkable survivor of Victorian Nashville. It's one of the few buildings of that era that we still have, along with the Customs House and Hume Fogg and some of those buildings. And nobody really knows what to do with it, so they eventually turned it over to the Nashville Film Commission. And that's how it ended up in some of your favorite movies. So here's some of our favorite ones right here. Tom Hanks and James Cromwell in the yard during the Green Mile in '99. You got Tom Bauer and Samuel L. Jackson in Against the Wall for HBO Pictures in 1994. That was literally 2 years after the prisoners left. You could still see it's behind Mr. Jackson. It's still in excellent shape at that point in time. And of course, the one that may have contributed to the nickname, James Gandolfini and Robert Redford in The Last Castle in 2001, one of the final big pictures that's been shot out there. But it's been in some major Hollywood productions over the last few years. In fact, while they were doing Against the Wall, it was Against the Wall, if you haven't seen it, is the story of the Attica riot of 1971 and the killings that followed that. And it was playing Attica Prison because it looks very much like it from the outside. The big difference was Attica is a red brick building, ours is a gray stone building. So the production crew painted the outside red. And the reason I bring that up is when we started this project, Yoshie was telling me, but it's red, it's gray, it's not yet. When I saw it, she shot something out there.
Where's the red prison? Where's the red prison? And I worked on a film, a movie of the week called The Conviction of Kitty Dodd when I first moved here to Nashville in the early 90s, and there was a red prison. So I didn't know my way around very well. I just figured there were two different prisons. And we finally connected the dots that they had painted the prison red to look like Attica, and eventually took the paint back down. But when they did Kitty Dodd, it was still that color.
So we solved a mystery right there. Yeah. We actually found a color slide of it, and it specifically said it had been painted red to be Attica for Against the Wall. So again, little mysteries were being solved as we were writing this project. Now, I'm notoriously irreverent, and when you're talking about movies, I told Yoshie last time, I don't know if I should really do this, but I did it last time, so I'm going to do it again.
That's my favorite part.
Oh, do you? Okay,
yes.
Good. Do you realize that this prison right here is only 4 degrees from Kevin Bacon? Yes, okay, let's start here. All right. 1994, it played Attica Correctional Facility, right there, see up there. Samuel L. Jackson was in Against the Wall as an Attica prisoner. In 1996, he was in A Time to Kill with Kiefer Sutherland. And in 1992, Kiefer Sutherland was in A Few Good Men with Kevin Bacon. Now, that's a remarkable coincidence. However, I got an even more remarkable one. I can connect the old prison to Kevin Bacon in 6 degrees, exactly 6 degrees. Okay, Ned Buntline is in the Tennessee State Prison for murder, 1846. Ned Buntline later meets and becomes a legend, part of Wyatt Earp's legend. Wyatt Earp is played by Kurt Russell in Tombstone in 1990. Kurt Russell is in Animal House with Donald Sutherland in 1978, and Donald Sutherland, he's in Backdraft 91 with Donald Sutherland. Donald Sutherland was at Animal House in 1978 with Kevin Bacon. So it is exactly, the old prison is 6 degrees from Kevin Bacon. This is a true celebrity we have on our hands. Now, it's goofy, it's silly, I agree. But the reason I say that is this is one of the more puzzling things about the prison and one of the harder things to answer. And that's also one of the reasons we both decided that this is a good platform to talk about it is, what do you do with it? It's a place of misery. It's a place of murder. It's a place of despair and squalor. It's also a beautiful piece of architecture and with a remarkable history. So it comes down to, what do you do with your history? This is the condition it was in about 4 years ago. It's in even worse condition now. If you want to go in to see the cell blocks, you've missed your chance. The black mold, it's condemned. They won't even let people in anymore. Even production crews, they don't get in. They get in the yard, you have to pay an escort and a guard and everything else, and you got to clear it with the film commission. Films can shoot there for free. Nobody's doing any maintenance, and the thing is falling apart. And you get the feeling in some ways, that's what they want to have happen with the thing. It's not a very happy place. But at the same time, it is history. And I've always taken the position that whether your history is something you want to repeat, or if it's a lesson on how not to do something, you ought to preserve what you have. And the Tennessee State Prison is in that weird no man's land. Nobody really knows what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years with it. Will it be pulled down? Will it fall apart and just be condemned? Will it be renovated and turned into something? Nobody knows. And there may not be a good answer. Because there's so many harsh memories attached to this place. But that's really where we kind of we both decided, I think, that was an excellent platform for the book, and a reason to take it is to start that discussion, to start people thinking, well, maybe if they hear some of those stories, as harsh as they are or as scary as they are, they're all object lessons, and there's some humor and there's some despair mixed in with it. Maybe it's time to start thinking about, what do we do with it from here on? And maybe it's something worth saving. I, for one, think, as bad as some of the stories are, it is. For better or for worse, it's still a remarkable structure with a remarkable history. So basically, that's my prepared notes, and I think I dragged a little bit longer than I intended to, but if you have any questions about anything, yeah.
Who's the architect?
Oh, who was the architect? I don't know that I wrote that down. That is a good question. I don't know if I put that in the book
I could have answered that a year ago.
Yeah, it's the same here. We found it.
Sorry.
There's actually online, I'll tell you where you can find it, is there's a Habs report on it on the Library of Congress. In fact, we use some of their free photographs, which is wonderful. The Library of Congress has the Historic American Building Survey. And in 1971, they did a full report on it. And it mentions all the architectural details, who built it, the history up to that point, and everything else. So that would be the best and easiest way to do it, is just get on the Library of Congress photographs website and look for Tennessee State Prison. And when you see that little PDF file, it says Habs, click on it, because that'll be more than you ever wanted to know about the Tennessee State Prison.
You know, it has a similar look to it as Union Station.
It does, but again, when you see a photograph of downtown Nashville in around 1910 or so, everything in this town had those turrets and those wonderful crenellations, everything. And then in the 1930s, everybody decided they were completely sick of that overnight, and they tore it all down. So today we've got a few, and they're remarkably similar, but I don't know that it was actually the same architectural firm that did that. So it just was the look of the time. I may be wrong, but I think that's actually 2 separate architectural firms that handled it.
Moffett did Union Station.
Yeah, so Moffett did that, and that's not sounding familiar, is it? It isn't to me. So again, I think it's more just the look of the times. That's what they liked, was that castle-like look right there. Yeah.
Has there ever been an attempt to put it on the historic register?
It's on the National Register of Historic Places. I believe it is.
Okay, so then it can't be destroyed.
Yeah, it can. Yeah, that's one of the big myths about that.
Fort Nashville, when we had at the last historic commission meeting, we had to vote to delist it.
Well, not necessarily. What the National Register of Historic Places essentially says is, if it's private property, now that's maybe the big difference, because Fort Nashville is city property. If it's private property, and the Film Commission, I believe, would qualify as private ownership, since it's a for-profit private entity, or not for-profit, but it's a private entity. Basically, what it provides is that it says that it is worthy of preservation, and that if you decide to preserve it using federal grant money, you have to adhere to the strict guidelines that they've set aside. But as one of my professors pointed out to me, who uses grant money to preserve anything in this country? It's most private owners do it out of their own pocket or get a loan from the bank or whatever it is. If you do that, you're free to do everything up to and including tearing it down. Now, if you change it beyond the original parameters, you can be kicked off the list. There's several houses I know in Brentwood recently that had additions added. They were 1850s buildings. They're no longer listed on the National Register because they've been changed beyond their original scope. So it's kind of a nice suggestion that maybe you should take over your past, but again, it's private versus government versus, not-for-profit. So that's really what it comes down to. Now, in Fort Nashville's case, that probably is complicated because that's city property. So since it's government property, they probably have to delist it to do something.
We have to delist it after the demolition, and then there's another category where you can put a sign up that says, this is what was here.
Right.
But that takes another year to process it, and it's 1 year
Right.
or so. Who knows if the city's
Yeah.
going to really follow through with their plans.
Exactly. So when it comes down to it, if you own a house and it's on the National Register of Historic Places, maybe I shouldn't say this, but you can tear it down. It's not, nobody's going to come with you with a nasty letter on the door. I just recommend you don't, or change it without consulting with somebody, because that's the loophole. Is basically it gives a lot to the property owner about what they intend to do if they're not a government entity. So that's probably the loophole in that case.
I have something of an answer to your question, sir, in our book.
It is in the book.
It's in the
yes.
book, yes. We apparently never located an architect. It was modeled after Auburn, as we know. And it was, when it was commissioned, it was built, the overseeing of the construction was by an Enoch Guy Elliott, was the name of the gentleman. And he was the superintendent that oversaw the building, but I don't have an architect.
And I would have lost money on that, because I swear it's one of those things where you say, oh yeah, we saw the architect. We probably didn't at this point. So, but check the Habs report if you're really curious. It may list it, and if we found it, that's where we found it. But yeah, she's got a much better memory for things like that than I do.
Actually,
I'm thinking of Elliott as the architect.
Which directed me to the page in the book.
There we go. And what's probably happening is I'm thinking of Elliott as the architect, so that probably is where I got confused. So. Are there any other questions about anything?
They saved James Earl Ray's door there.
Yep.
In the mess hall.
Yep, James Earl Ray. He's in the book. We put him in because he was in there briefly. In fact, during the pork chop riot, I believe he was in, no, it was the later riot in '85. He was a resident, and he never left his cell during the whole thing. He just basically, his block was not affected, but James Earl Ray did do some time in there, and yeah, they preserved his cell door. Where did they put that, by the way?
It's in the mess hall. The police department used it for the Christmas baskets.
Oh, okay.
Last time I saw it, was 2 years ago, cleaning this door.
There we go.
That's all what the police department uses.
So yeah, it's odd. It's one of those things where, yeah, it's not a very pleasant memory, but it just feels weird to throw it out, doesn't it? It's it is part of the history, whether we like it or not.
Well, so are you all ready for my hour now?
I want to thank you for staying awake, by the way. I tend to ramble. Well, if that's all if there are no other questions or anything, we'll just.
Is the book available for sale?
Yes, we have a handful of them here today, and we're selling them for $20. It's about, I think they're on the shelf, they're $21.99, but we'll do them even for $20 today.
Yeah, so if you want to pick up a copy of our book, now is a perfect time to do that, and we really appreciate it if you do. But having said that, that was the part I forgot. She always tells you, plug the book. That's it. But that's the commercial. But I want to thank you all for coming out and having us here. I want to thank Ken for inviting us and just letting us be a part of this. And thank you very much for your attendance. It's great.